does zero trust security model change the way we design networks moving forward? And if so, what does that look like? So zero trust, define that as you do not trust whatever the endpoint is. You've got to come up with some way to trust that and then allow it on. And the assumption is whatever's out there is bad news. So what's the impact to network design, the zero trust security model? Have any of you run into this, you're needing to deploy this or looking at products that are thinking zero trust?
I don't know if I'd call it zero trust, but in the service provider world, typically any end user home is completely untrusted, right? So that model exists. You don't trust what they're putting on the network. You don't want it to be able to touch your GUI center. Where I think this is probably pointed is more in the enterprise space for something like having, full access port, knowledge of the user that's plugged into the port, that certain technologies will give you. You get similar options with the gosh, now I can't remember the name of it. Basically, it's an authentication system.
It's related around identity-based networking.
Yes.
Companies and Google's BeyondCorp, in that they can identify the users according to laptop, according to app, and it doesn't matter whether you're in the internet, accessing the public cloud, or accessing the enterprise.
Yep, that's what I was very poorly trying to say.
Yeah. And Nick, do keep in mind that in the ISP world, yes, you don't trust the user, but you're also not blamed for all the crap that happens to the user.
That's a good point. You can push that off when your DMCA compliance stuff comes in.
Well, or if someone breaks into the user's laptop, you're not the one to blame, whereas in the enterprise environment, you're always to blame, regardless of what the user did.
There's another context here for zero trust, which is presumption of breach, in that you just kind of assume that something's infected or has malware or will be. And so how do you manage that? And part of that answer is or one of the answers that different other vendors have is microsegmentation. The idea of you are going to take this workload, this server, whatever it is, you're going to basically run filtering in front of it, all depending on the solution. There's various grades of this solution, and only allow that workload to talk to whatever it's supposed to, and only allowed inbound traffic from other things that it's supposed to, because you baseline that traffic and you know what all the application communications are, and so on. That doesn't affect network design as such. I mean, it ends up affecting where your enforcement points are. And it's a different, you're solving it's a distributed firewall problem that is solved in various ways by companies like VMware with NSX, with Illumio are doing that. Apparetto is another startup that's doing something very different in this space, but they're certainly addressing zero trust, not just with filtering, but actually with authentication of the endpoints that you're speaking to as well. They've got a fairly complex model to make all of that happen. Now, Yvonne, you were chuckling as soon as I said microsegmentation, hiding behind your hand, but I still saw it. So what was going through your mind?
No, the real problem I see, I love microsegmentation, and yes, it can solve a number of problems that we have today. But the real problem always is, do you actually know who should be talking to whom? And in most enterprises, the answer is you have no clue.
That's what I've seen as well, because companies will say, well, yeah, we can do true microsegmentation, different vendors, but what it boils down to, I think, is the organization. Do you really know, honestly, what needs to talk to where? And a lot of times, the network engineering teams or the organizations, they just don't know, and they're so siloed. Unfortunately, the communication doesn't happen sometimes as it needs to. So.
There is a process for that. I mean, Eric, I know in the Cisco world, it's tetration. You're gonna use tetration, baseline the network. With Illumio, they're gonna have you be in watch mode for a long time. I think NSX is kind of the same, where you watch long enough and then put it into once you've got your baseline rule set that's been created based on observation of network flows, then you put it into a test mode, and then if that all goes, you finally push them into prod. Just because to address that issue, no one actually knows who's supposed to talk to what, and even if they tell you they do, they probably don't.
Correct.
And
so this brings up a point that keeps banging around in my head, that really this feels like a they've taken a term and just, stamped out this term, but really what the problem that they're trying to solve is figuring out what's happening on the network, right? They want to be able to prevent certain things on that network, but instead of figuring out what's actually happening, the solution is to say, I just don't trust anything. And so I have to, give approval for everything that needs to transit X, Y, and Z. Where in reality, it might be a better model to have good monitoring, good baselines, and know what kind of traffic is transiting into where, internally and externally.
But that's the harder problem to solve. Where I've seen it deployed is it's not really zero trust in that we don't trust anything rather. It's that, all right, we get our best guess of who's supposed to talk to who. We use Yvonne's microsegmentation and microsegment things as much as possible. We throw on identity management, we throw on monitoring, we throw on baselining. As far as how does that affect network design, like you said, Ethan, it doesn't physically, except for you got to then account for extra traffic, maybe some, extra ping-ponging back and forth on the identity management part. You've got to make sure that latency doesn't frustrate your users, and et cetera.
Well, there is one minor thing where at least microsegmentation might affect network design. Namely, it's almost impossible to do on the physical switches. We run out of DKIM, period.
If you're talking about what's actually in the switch, Yvonne, with pushing ACLs into the switch?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do microsegmentation on the physical switch, and I really don't care whether it's called ACL or ACI, effectively you will run out of TCAM at any decent level of granularity, not to mention that you can't do reflexive access control lists, so you can't track session state.
It's the big lesson we learned from ACI in the last 3 years, is that it can't scale. ACI is good for small business networks, but it doesn't scale much.
Erica's biting her tongue. Literally.
Speak up, a few thousand hosts and ACI is out of steam usually. So.
Well, now, okay, so I guess we need to talk about, we need to specify, are we talking about campus network, enterprise network, or are we talking about data center?
Yeah, because there's two different models here, right? I mean, microsegmentation, we're typically talking about data center, but talking about zero trust for users and user endpoints is very different. 802.1x models, integrating solutions like ClearPass, ICE, etc., that are managing that identity for you is a very different kind of an animal. So two different really conversations there.
And that's actually what I was talking about. That's where I've seen it more growing interest in it.
Yeah, but there's identity management, which is totally out of band, and whatever you do there, no problem. And then the problem is, do you want to enforce some security rules based on the identity? And how granular do you want to be? I mean, if you just say, well, this is marketing, it can get to marketing VRF, that's easy. If you say, well, this is a user, it can only get to this and this and this and this and this and this server.
Yeah.
And you list 200 servers per user per port, good luck.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
This feels like a reboot of NAC to me. Maybe I'm being.
Rule 11, Nick, Rule 11.
Well, I'd be interested in Erica's answer to Greg. Because you kind of have more visibility, perhaps, in things than we do. What are you seeing for ACI scaling?
That's a good question. So within the government sector, which is where I've worked at, I'm seeing a lot of customers now go into adopt either the ACI, not the stretch fabric or the remote lease, but more of the multi-site, and it's dealing with more or less like 1 or 2 data centers. I haven't seen it extend past that, and it's been a very limited scope. What I've run into a lot is a lot of people want to have ACI and automation, but they don't have a clear understanding of what it's going to take to automate your existing infrastructure, and then you really have to know that, like what we've been talking about previously, is that you have to know that inside out. And if you don't, then it's got to be a lot of, preparation and planning. And I think a lot of the customers, they get kind of, what I would say, a little bit shy, a little bit with trying to go from a campus environment to a full ACI spine leaf architecture. And then at that point, once, let's say you get it installed and implemented, that's great, but now you need to actually use it and put an application there. So then what is that going to look like? So that's what I've seen, that kind of where from a vendor perspective, it doesn't matter if it's Cisco, Juniper, we can kind of help the customer out with trying to go from that planning to full migration, because it's not just only looking at installing equipment and then now wash my hands of it and I'm done. It's about the full path, the full journey. So it's more of to answer the question directly, I've seen it more scaled down to like a couple of data centers, and that's about it.
So I've done ACI deployments with like 3,500 VMs a rack. The scale is fine. The problem is how, to what Yvonne was saying, how much micro segmenting do you want to do? And then to me, the big question for that is, how much should you burden the network with that? Is the network going to be all things to all people, or do you push it up the stack? So obviously all open questions, religious war time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Going back to Illumio, just I'm somewhat familiar with their solution. Their answer to how you scale it is you do distributed enforcement, where every endpoint, either it's a Linux box running IP tables or it's a Windows box running the Windows firewall, is where the enforcement is happening. So you don't have some central point of enforcement. You're not loading up TCAM with ACLs, et cetera.